Thank you.
Hello, guys. I'm José Mayubi and host of the José Mayubi Path Trip STEM channel and philosophy study in Brazil.
I'm Guilherme Grossi. I am a economics undergraduate student in Brazil, and I'm here to help Jose with this interview.
So, guys, a brief introduction by Professor Philip Pettit. Philip Pettit, one of the most renowned political philosophers today, is a professor at the Princeton University and distinguished professor at the Australian National University. His new book, The State, is a major contribution to contemporary political theory about the state. Unfortunately, there is not translation in Portuguese yet. Professor Filipperi, it's an honor having you here, especially Guy and I like so much Republican thought.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for your welcome, Jose and William.
So let's start a more or less biographical question. What initially inspired your interest in the Republic tradition, and which seminal works within this tradition have been most influential in shape your intellectual perspective?
Well, as it happens, I discovered I was a Republican, so to speak, or believed in Republican conception of freedom before I recognized that it was really part of the long Republican tradition. I had been thinking it would have been in the late 1980s, early 1990s. I'd been thinking about how one should conceive of freedom if you recognize that human beings invariably live in society and invariably live under a rule of law, under a state. And you have to think about freedom as a relationship between people who, as it were, have to live together. I felt that a lot of traditions had thought about freedom as something which you enjoyed perfectly if you were the only person in the universe. And I thought that had to be wrong. You have to think about freedom as something that essentially requires social life. And that led me to think that, well, you enjoy freedom in relation to other people insofar as you are allowed, you have the power to make your own decisions in your own way without the others, so to speak, standing over you, with the others controlling you. And in working on this way of thinking about freedom, someone said, you ought to read some recent work on the history of Republican thinking about freedom. And Quentin Skinner had been um, really a lifetime friend of mine, though he was working in England, I was working in Australia. And it turned out that he had been writing various articles about the history of freedom within the long Republican tradition. We can maybe talk about that later, what that tradition is. And he had been criticizing an earlier historian, John Pocock, who had maintained that in this tradition, people thought about freedom in what Isaiah Berlin would have called positive terms. He had argued that in this tradition, they thought to be free was just to be um, the member of a self-determining society or collectivity, in that sense, to have that positive freedom. And Quentin had been arguing that no, when you look at the precise texts, both in the Roman tradition, but also in medieval and early modern authors, like, for example, Machiavelli, in his work on the discourses of Livy, you don't find that positive notion of freedom, but rather a more negative notion. I guess what I argued was then, as a result of reading all of these texts to which Quentin Skinner's work directed me, I came to think, yes, it was indeed a negative notion, but it wasn't quite the same negative notion that later became popular in the classical liberal tradition, the notion of freedom as non-interference. And I early on came to give it the name, it meant really non-domination. So I became very excited to discover that actually when you look at the Roman authors, for example, people like Polybius and Cicero, or the historians like Sallust and Livy and Tacitus, or when you look at even medieval authors of the kind Skinner was expert on and introduced us all to, or you look at someone like Machiavelli, not in his work on the Prince, but in his work on the discourses of Livy, the earlier Roman historian, on focusing on Livy's image of Republican Rome. And in particular, when you look at the 17th century English writings on republicanism, and then later the American and French writings on this topic, what you discover is they really thought about freedom not as in the positive way of Berlin's notion, but not in the liberal way either, that it just involved your not being interfered with. They thought that in order to have freedom, you had to have power as against others. And in particular, you had to be able to make your choices independently of the power of others to interfere with you, so that you could be made unfree by another's just having power over your decision making, even if they didn't actually interfere with you. The fact that you had to make your choice in the shadow of their power, that already made you unfree. And that for me was very exciting. And, I immediately came to think of that I was really a Republican in that long traditional sense of republicanism.
Great answer, Professor Filippelli. Since the publication of a theory of freedom and the government in 97, how do you perceive the evolution of your own intellectual trajectory? And in your view, Professor Filippelli, might the republicanism emerge as a more robust framework in light of the significant challenges liberalism has faced in recent years?
Well, I guess even when I wrote that book in 1997, I was aware that neoliberalism, as it was then called, the right-wing version of liberalism, very much liberalism, not in the sense of American liberalism, which is more left-leaning, left of center, but the right-wing liberalism that was known as neoliberalism was actually very, very similar to a doctrine that had been advanced in the early 1900s, sorry, in the early 19th century, the early 1800s. And I came to see that republicanism was really the natural opponent of that classical liberal way of thinking. If you like, the classical Republican way of thinking was very different from the classical liberal way of thinking. Now, in the years following that book, and I did write about that book, in that book about that contrast, and I also wrote about the broad, as it were, policies of government that the notion of freedom as non-domination would support. But over the following years, I certainly became ever clearer, I think, about the significance of this way of thinking about freedom when it came to issues of justice. So let me give you an example of, I think I came to realize that there were really three areas where justice is important when it comes to talking about people and their state. And I came to think that freedom as non-domination, that ideal, would actually serve very well in articulating each of these domains of justice. So maybe I should say a little before going into the three domains of justice about exactly how I was thinking then, and I think how people generally think now about freedom as non-domination. So, for example, in quite early on, I don't think this was in the original book, I took as an example to illustrate the contrast between freedom as non-domination and freedom as non-interference. I took an example of a play, Henrik Ibsen's play called A Doll's House, which he's a Norwegian playwright, as you know, who published this play in the 1870s, and it describes a world in which men had all the legal power over their wives. And it focuses on the relationship between a young banker, Thorvald, and his wife, Nora. And in this play, Thorvald is represented as, of course, having all the power. He had the power, for example, to dictate what clothes Nora would wear, who she could associate with, whether she could go to the theater or not, whether she should go shopping in public places. He had complete control over her life in law. But as a matter of fact, he doted on Nora. He was utterly in love with her. And so he tended to allow her, as we say in French, carte blanche. I mean, as in to allow her to do whatever she wished within the range of normally available choices in Norway in the 1860s, which is where the play is set. And then the question that play raises is, Nora is not interfered with in any way by Thorvald. He, after all, gives her way in all reasonable respects, but he does have power over her. And the question is Nora free or not in relation to Thorvald? Now, if you thought that freedom just meant non-interference, then Nora certainly was free. She was not actually interfered with. But if you thought that freedom required non-domination, that is to say, no one in the position of a master or a dominus in your life, no one able to interfere if they wished, then you'd have to say she was unfree. And it's very interesting. I've asked audiences in many, many countries, really in South America, but also in Asia, in China, in Europe, in Australia, in America. I've often posed the question, is Nora free, especially to student gatherings? And invariably everyone says, no, Nora is not free. And then I say, well, that what you are now accepting is that in order to be free, you can't have someone with power over you, as Torvald had power over Nora. Okay, so that's the core notion. Now, what I came to see more clearly, I think, in the years following that initial book, was that there are three areas where this notion of freedom is very important. First of all, in the relationship between citizens. So I came to see that if each citizen, assuming we want citizens to have equality, if each citizen is to enjoy the same degree of non-domination as others, then that can only be under a system of law. And that system of law would have to do two things. It would have to indicate what are the choices in which each person should be able to make up their own mind independently of the power of others over them. And in the long tradition of republicanism, such choices were always called the basic liberties, the fundamental liberties. So the first thing you have to do in looking at what the relationship between citizens should be, in looking at, as it were, social justice among citizens, is to identify the basic liberties in which each person should be adequately secured against the power of others in exercising those choices. Now, of course, the question is, what would adequate security require? And what I argued is that in this area of social justice, what adequate security against the power of others requires is that while there may be differences of power between people, differences of wealth and resources and cultural clout or whatever, it should be the case that each has enough security or protection under the law to be able to look others in the eye, as I put it, without reason for fear or deference, to be able to be their own person, to be able to walk tall, to stand tall, to be equal with them, and treat others as equals. They should have enough security to do that. That doesn't mean that everyone should be absolutely have to have the same wealth and no more than others, or have to have the same cultural position and power. That's impossible. But what law can do, I argued, is secure people well enough for them to be able to satisfy the eyeball test. Excuse me, as I came to think of it. And that eyeball test fits with the long Republican tradition, in which they always talk about the free person is someone who can walk tall, someone who doesn't have to bow and scrape to others, someone who doesn't have to kowtow in that Chinese term, someone who is their own man or their own woman. I mean, I argue that in social justice, law should protect people equally against the interference of others in the sphere of the basic liberties, but equally that law should enable those in need to be able to exercise their basic liberties. And that requires, of course, a system of social security, a system of medical security, a system of judicial security, in which people, if they're brought to law, can, excuse me, can be given legal assistance, judicial assistance by the law itself, by the state. So the law should be protecting people and empowering people sufficiently that each should be able to enjoy these basic liberties adequately. And at that adequate level, everyone should at least have that adequate level of security. So for me, that was a theory of social justice, which republicanism, at least now in a renovated form, if you like, neo-republicanism or civic republicanism would support. So that was the first of three areas, but maybe we should stop at that point for the moment. You may have other questions, or William may have other questions, rather than rushing on to the other two areas of justice.
Your
Great.
example with the play is very insightful. I've never thought about in that way liberty in a situation where one can have complete uh, pseudo freedom in that case because she doesn't have the power to to be the same person that her husband is, but at the same time she has the non-interference aspect uh, of classical
Exactly.
liberalism. She has her husband doesn't interfere in her decisions, but she still doesn't have that same, in your words, the same capability of looking her husband in the eye as an equal person.
Yes, because
And
she would have to be anxious to keep her husband sweet, to placate her husband, to ingratiate herself with her husband, and that already means she really isn't a free or frank person. She can't be her own woman because she's always under the shadow of his power.
so, on that note, do you think that the Republican conception of freedom is more conducive to a just form of government than the dominant liberal approaches, such as those advanced by Berlin and Rawls, particularly insofar as republicanism places a stronger emphasis on the common good and civic responsibility?
Well, I think that Rawls himself defends quite a radical, social democratic position, which I'm sympathetic with in general, but he does so on the basis of two distinct principles, as you remember. One is the notion that everyone should have equal freedom, but by freedom he means freedom from interference. And of course, you could give people equal freedom from interference, while some have enormous power and others have very little power. And they have freedom from interference just insofar as, um, for example, they keep the powerful happy. like Nora keeps Thorvald happy. And so, what Rawls does to compensate for the weakness of the neoliberal notion of freedom, let's call it, is require, in addition, that there should be socioeconomic equality. That's the second principle of justice, or that at least if you depart from equality, that should only be because it benefits the position of the worst off. Now, you don't have to introduce a separate principle of socioeconomic equality on the Republican approach. You just take freedom in itself and the notion of a free person as someone who can exercise the basic liberties like everybody else, secure against the power of others. I mean, they may choose to make friends, they choose to marry, they choose to, as it were, make themselves dependent on others, but they don't have to. And if you go the Republican way, you get a very simple starting point. You don't have two principles of justice, you have one principle. And the really important point is that because it's essential that others should not have power over you, that means that the law has to protect you against poverty, against the sort of position you'd be in if you're terminally ill or you're incapacitated in some ways. The law has to be able to provide a system of bottom-up empowerment of the needy in order to guard them against the power of the wealthy. But equally, the law has to be there to empower, I would say, workers in most workplace situations in order to guard them against the power of employers. For example, in the classical liberal neoliberal approach, every employer should be able to fire or dismiss his or her workers at will, just by his or her choice. Well, if that's the case, then in most societies, workers are not going to be able to look their employer in the eye without reason for fear or deference. And so, in order to guard against that, you have to have good laws governing employment relationships. I mean, they must make it possible for an employer to fire a worker who's not pulling his or her weight, of course. But it mustn't be just at the whim of an employer that they can fire the worker. And, lots of people now working in the Republican tradition, including many labor lawyers, there are a number of them, have been using these ideas in order to articulate proper, so to speak, laws of the employment relationship, workplace laws, and so on. So anyhow, that's to emphasize the need for this social justice element. If people are going to enjoy freedom as non-domination in relation to one another, or in relation to private corporations or other agencies, then the law has to give them freedom by giving them a pushback power against those who are wealthier or more resourced or whatever it might be, thereby inducing a capacity at least for people to be able to look one another in the eye without a reason for fear or deference.
Great, thanks, Professor Filippetti. Professor Filippetti, what is the significance of the Roman legal tradition from development of Republic thought? And in your view, what have been the most substantial advance in contemporary Republic studies, particularly within legal and political theory, including your own contributions?
Well, there are two elements of contributions, aren't there? One is, does it have any impact on any actual political systems? And the other is, has it been having an impact on ways of thinking about politics? On the first, as I think you know, because I think you mentioned it early on, um, Zapatero, the Prime Minister of Spain between 2004 and 2011, he embraced the Republican way of thinking, as I and various others, of course, had been articulating it. And he made the principles of Republican thought his guiding principles, especially in the first parliament of the Zapatero government between 2004 and 2008, which was before the great financial crisis, which tended to distract from all positive policy making, really. And in that period, he had invited me to give a lecture in Madrid to introduce the Republican way of thinking, which he had actually been citing in his electoral campaign and so on. Um, and in the course of the lecture, I jokingly said to him that I strongly approved of one policy he had already introduced, which was to make the national broadcaster in Spain independent of the government of the day. And he had claimed to do this on the basis of a recommendation in my book. Um, and I said, that's wonderful, but it's very easy to be a philosopher like me, working out principles of a political philosophy. You're going to find it very hard to live up to the principles of this philosophy. For example, I said, you're going to find it hard to resist lifting the telephone and complaining to the director of the national broadcaster if, as it was likely to turn out, they were your worst critic a year from now. And he was very exercised by this challenge. And in response, when he replied to my lecture, he invited me to write a report on his government, looking at how far it had been faithful to Republican principles 6 months prior to the following election, which was due in early 2008, and which I did that in later 2007. And I think he made some terrific legislative changes as a result of following this philosophy. And he was always very anxious to justify his position by reference to the principles of Republican philosophy. So, for example, changes he made, his was the third legislature in the world to, for example, legalize gay marriage, homosexual marriage. And he actually used the eyeball test in Parliament in justifying this. He said in Parliament, which of you, my colleagues who are heterosexual, can leave this Parliament and expect someone gay, a homosexual, to look you in the eye without reason for fear or deference if you have been essentially saying to him or her, your intimate relations are not worthy of the same legal protection as my intimate family relations are. And that was really very effective, I think. I mean, I wrote a book with a Spanish legal theorist, political theorist, Jose Luis Martí, in which he has a chapter describing exactly how that happened. But that was an example of the philosophy having a real impact on the ground. And indeed, it shaped many other of Zapatero's policies at the time also, such as, for example, giving women far more rights. And in fact, I think his may have been one of the first cabinets in the world, government cabinets, which had a majority of women in it, and he sought to establish quotas of women on company boards and so on, and introduced domestic legislation governing domestic relations, which were meant to bolster the position of women. But apart from that, he made many other changes as well that I strongly disapproved of. One was actually legalizing the position of 750,000 illegal immigrants into Spain. He did that, I think, in 2006, 2007. And he did it by bringing people along with him. I mean, he was essentially very democratically minded, which reminds me of the second area of justice, which is democratic justice versus social justice, where I think Republican thought has also got significance. So that was one impact on actual government. Um, Perhaps there have been others of a more minor kind, but I'm not an expert in any case on that front. Where I think Republican thought has had an influence intellectually on ways of thinking. Well, a good example is the one I mentioned on thinking about employment law and labor law. Um, there are, lawyers, for example, I can think of some in New York, some in Oxford, some in Britain, who have been using these ideas in elaborating uh, reforms in the area of labor law and employment law that would actually seek to further this Republican goal of enabling workers basically to enjoy dignity, to be able to look their employers in the eye without reason for fear or deference. I think that requires employment laws that constrain the relationship. I also think it requires laws that allow unions to operate um, under specified circumstances, because I think that they're very important to protecting workers and that. But that's the second an area of, as where political legal thought, where I think the approach has had some influence.
If Jose allows me to, um, there is something that when you were speaking about the laws passed in Spain about by the Zapatero government, I was when you were talking about the workers' power of bargaining with their employees, or with their employers, sorry. Um, I was reminded of the Dutch polder model and how they try to implement something alike, at least when
I'm sorry, what is the model as you described
the
it?
polder, Polder.
I see.
Uh,
Yeah.
uh,
Perhaps you would describe
he,
that for us.
yeah, it's basically what I was going to use to move on to the next question.
Yeah.
It's because it's a very Christian democratic way of organizing worker relationships in like the German Christian Democratic Union and the in the Netherlands the Christian Democratic parties too have like this uh, the neo corporatist model of Christian democratic parties. Uh, they emphasize subsidiary and intermediary institutions in workers employers relationships. I am especially interested in how these differences manifest in practical policy making and governance structures in your Republican thought.
Well, I think of republicanism or Republican philosophy as a research program, as I've said many times, and Frank Lovett and I have published a paper arguing that it is a research program. And it's a research program that says, look, this is what government should be, this is what the state and the law and government should be seeking to achieve. It should be seeking to achieve social justice in the sense I've just been talking about, but also, and we'll get onto that, democratic justice. And the argument is that when you work out the requirements of freedom as non domination in these areas, that directs you to issues about, well, what's the best institution, for achieving this effect. And it's at that level where the sort of proposals you're mentioning are really going to be relevant in determining which are the best um, proposals for achieving that effect. So, for example, one standard traditional response has been to say, well, what we should have is workers' democracy within the workplace. Now, as a matter of fact, I think I've been persuaded that's a very nice idea, but almost certainly not feasible for a whole range of reasons. and that we have to look for other institutions, other institutional checks, and so on how factories are governed, on how workplaces are governed, in order to achieve the Republican goal of enabling workers to be free persons in relation to their employers. But at that level of institutional research or institutional design, that's a level where, I mean, I'm not an expert, I'm a philosopher, and that's an area where you need a connection between, on the one hand, philosophers, but on the other hand, lawyers, political scientists, and economists like yourself. Um, I'm actually very fascinated, for example, to see that there's an economist, because lots of lawyers have taken up these ideas and lots of political scientists too. Economists, not so much, but actually, Darren Acemoglu, who's a Nobel laureate economist, is has a manuscript of a book in place in which he himself endorses freedom as non-domination as the core notion, and it's one that should also be made use of in economics in designing economic institutions. But that really is a matter of, applying or implementing the research program that this as an abstract philosophy supports. And there has to be a degree of experimentation, as in ideally people may come up with institutions that sound like good ideas, but actually turn out not to work very well in practice. That's all got to be part of advancing the program, that people explore these ideas, explore these institutional responses to the problems identified as problems for a Republican approach, and then explore what the best institutions are to put in place.
Great, yes,
So
Professor.
maybe,
I
yeah.
have a question about your new book, The State. One of the key victories of your recent work, The State, is adoption of a realistic framework in both historical and normative terms. How do you position your conception of realism in relate to more traditional or canonical formulation, such as those of Hasmargental, Bernard Williams, Machiavelli, and Hobbes? And what ways does your realistic approach resonate or diverge from these influential figures?
Okay, this may give us a chance to talk a little bit about democratic justice as well. So first of all, on the realism issue, I mean, as you know, there's a big divide between people who call themselves realist theories of politics versus those presumably unrealistic theories of politics. I think it's really worth saying, first of all, that realism comes in degrees. A political theory is more realistic to the extent to which it makes assumptions that certain aspects of the world as we know it, the real world, so to speak, really are not up for grabs. They're not easily going to be changed. So, for example, Rawls's approach within the theory of justice, he says, what do we assume about the society where we're going to introduce these institutions that answer to his notion of justice? And he says, well, we need to assume the following, that it's a society of how does he put it? It's a society of individuals who pursue their mutual advantage. And it's a society of individuals who are not rankly self-serving. They're relatively open to the interests of others, but they are all in pursuit of mutual advantage. That's a very abstract conception of society. I am more realistic to the extent to which I think we have to now accept that we're never going to get rid of states. So when it comes to the issue of what does justice require, I think it's just simply a waste of time to say, well, maybe it requires us to get rid of states to live in a wholly state-free universe, a you know a an anarchist sort of image of the world. I mean, it might be impossible, it might be in principle, that might be a better world, a world without states and the world with states. But I think we're stuck with states, and I can't see any way in which states would cease to exist. Partly because there's a web of states, and each state has to hold its ground in order to protect, well, if the rulers protect themselves and protect their peoples, because if they resigned, for example, another state is simply going to take over the territory, given there's this web of competitive states. So I say we have to assume the state is there, as it were, for uh, the indefinite future, and then ask, what does justice require of the state? And in order to approach that question, I feel that we ought to think, before approaching the justice question, more about, well, what are the features that characterize a state? What are the features we might expect states to retain, um, at least if they're serving their function as states? Now, in that book, and we didn't go through the argument, I argued that the main function of states is to provide a system of law under which the group we can call citizens, of residents who are relatively powerful at any rate, they can know where they stand under that law, where they stand vis-a-vis one another. That's the element of social justice, and also where they stand relative to vis-a-vis their authorities. Now, such a state, of course, you could have a state like that, but a state that's very unjust, partly because, let's say, not all residents are citizens. It's restricted maybe to an aristocracy or an elite. So, well, justice is going to require of the state, if the state is the source of law, that the citizenry should be inclusive. That's going to be the first requirement. And secondly, then, and that's where republicanism comes in, it's going to tell you how far the law should enable people to know where they stand. And the Republican demand should be that the law should give people, each person, this is social justice, a range of choices that they can exercise with impunity, that's to say, without the law punishing them, and with security, that is to say, without others interfering with them. The law should both say you can do the following things and then stop others interfering with you in doing those things, and also empower you if you are in need of resources because of poverty or whatever it might be, because of disablement or something, in order to be able to exercise those choices. So the idea is that approaching it in this way, um, you take the state as given, you characterize its features, which is what I try to do in that book, and then you say, well, where now might we build a just state with these materials? And that's a book actually I'm writing at the moment, which is a follow-up to the state book, and will be a rewriting in a way of Republican theory, but now in light of this theory of what the state is. And when I say rewriting Republican theory, it should be working out what exactly the state should do for social justice. And now, if we could move on, I think we should at this point, what equally it should achieve in the way of democratic justice.
Professor Pettit, you reminded me of a an economist that I've been reading. His name is Arman Alkian. He is he was a Armenian American economist from UCLA. And
Yes,
when you talked about the state as an institution, I think he has a very interesting reading of the evolution of institutions. Like they the state evolved as a very useful tool for humans to organize themselves. I believe, and I believe
that's
that's
exactly
how.
what I think too. Yes.
Yeah, and I believe that's how he saw the state as well. And in chapter 6 of your book, it's called the demands of the market. You offer a critical perspective on the libertarian view of the market and present several examples illustrating how markets rely on the state to function properly. In a nutshell, from your point of view, what is the necessary relationship between the state and the market, and what are the main limitations inherent in that relationship?
Okay, well, this is still in the area of social justice. So, in what I wanted to argue in the State book was that to look at the areas where, so to speak, justice might be introduced in order to change the performance of the state. And I mentioned some already that the citizenry should be made inclusive, and that they should each achieve um, security in the exercise of their basic liberties. And I mentioned that one issue will be, for example, how employers are treated within the workplace. But now more generally, the issue is what will justice require the state to do in the area of the economy? And here the big opposition is those opponents, often neoliberal, who say that the state should not touch the economy. They often say the economy is self-regulating and that the state should keep out of the economy. Now, what I wanted to argue in the State book was that actually, when you look at how economies function in worldwide, really, you see that the economy depends essentially on the law, which depends on the state, that it's the law and the state that lay down, for example, what property titles are, what the rights of ownership are, that lays out what the rules of the marketplace exchange are, that lay down what currency is the official legal tender in which people can exchange, and that lays down the conditions under which corporations may form and what constraints there are on what corporations may do. So that was just to illustrate that the economy already depends on the state. Now, what I didn't address in that book, and will have to address in the new book, is well, what power should the state exercise in shaping the economy? Should it, for example, change the nature of corporate law as it exists at the moment? Um, for example, corporations are allowed to own and control other corporations, where they, however, are not legally responsible for what the other corporation does. The other corporation, if it breaks the law, well, it's only it, the controlled corporation, that has to, as it were, foot the bill or answer in the courts. The controlling corporation is, well, I'm just a shareholder. Okay, there are issues like that, and there are going to be issues to consider in the new book as to exactly what the state should be doing. Now, my only general comment, I think, in response to your question, William, would be to say that I think neoliberals are right in the following respect, that while the state is invariably involved in setting up the economy, the government should not interfere too erratically in the economy, changing taxes, changing tariffs all the time, changing the rules of incorporation. That's bad for the economy. And I think that's right. And that has been one of the neoliberal or one of the libertarian lessons. And I think that's correct. Very strikingly, of course, that's exactly what President Trump is doing at the moment in America. He is really doing very bad things by the economy. And actually, I think that neo-Republican theory would critique that sort of in-out, chop and change, because you make the economy, it's very uncertain. The economy serves us well. The market serves us well, insofar as people are prepared to take long-term risks, but for benefits that may actually accrue to society as a whole, as well as to themselves. But what you do is you undermine that willingness to take risks if you keep intervening in the way Trump is doing in the economy. So, ironically, Trump is actually going against what I would see as sensible Republican policy in that area. But no, I really think you should. I'm going to ask myself a question. I think we should talk a little bit about democratic justice. Is that okay, Jose?
Um,
You're the one in charge, I think.
yeah. You can you're free to elaborate on democratic justice any way you want to.
I think it's essential for this reason. If you agree that people enjoy social justice and enjoy freedom vis-a-vis one another and vis-a-vis private agencies, by virtue of the law making that possible, by virtue of the law protecting them and securing them in the sense of empowering them if they're in need. But of course, that raises a question of, well, wait a moment, how about those people who at any time are imposing the law on people? They have a vertical relationship, so to speak, to ordinary people versus the horizontal relationship of people with one another. Social justice is about justice in the horizontal relationships of people with one another. Democratic justice is about what should be the relationship of people vertically with the government that imposes the law on them. Because after all, if you had a despot, for example, imposing the law just as they wished, then that despot would be a dominus in the life of everyone. They'd all have to hang on, his goodwill and hope, or her goodwill, and just hope to heaven that they were benevolent. Now, there's a long tradition of thinking, well, 19th century tradition, 18th maybe as well, of thinking that a benevolent despotism is a very good form of government. But actually, for a Republican, for whom freedom means non domination, benevolent despotism would be awful. It would just mean you have someone with huge power, enormous power over everyone in the society, who just happens to be using their power of interference and making laws, always interfering with people, happens to use it benevolently. That means you're totally exposed to the power of that despot. Or take a better example, if you've got a colonial power that establishes the law in a distant colony, it may actually establish a law that is socially not bad at all, right? But insofar as it's got all the power of changing law as it wishes, then it's a dominus in relation to them. That actually was at the core of the American colonists' complaint against Britain at the time of the American War of Independence, because Britain had imposed, if you remember, had imposed what was called um, the stamp duty or tax on people in the colonies, on British people in the colonies, and they had protested and said, we don't like this tax. We're paying taxes already to our local government and so on. And the British government was benevolent. They said, okay, we'll withdraw that tax. That was in 1766. But at the same time as they withdrew the tax, the stamp duty, the British government insisted they passed something called the Declaratory Act, in which they claimed that while we're being nice to you now, we, the British government, the Westminster Parliament, have the power to dictate whatever laws we wish, regardless of your wishes. Um, and we're asserting that as of right. And now that was a real affront to the American colonists because they had always, and at that time, really Republican thinking, as I'm describing it, was very common in American English speaking circles. They saw this as you're claiming to be the dominus. This is the ultimate slavery. You're vertical, as it were, despotism from on top. And so the big issue in Republican philosophy is not just how do you achieve social justice, that is to say, private freedom as non-domination, but how do you achieve public freedom as non-domination so that the government that imposes law is not a dominus in your life? And just to give a very brief response to that question, because I'm conscious we're running out of time, um, imagine people who, because of ill health or old age, have to live in a retirement home. They can't leave the home, and the home has to have a management. Does that mean that they're dominated by the management? Well, not if they can dictate the terms on which the management makes its decision. Management, let's suppose, has the power to decide when they eat their meals, when there are breaks, when there are lights out, when they can have visitors and when not. But if the residents of the home can establish constraints on the management, that require them to exercise their decisions only on the terms that they, the residents, agree on, then the interference of management in the life of the residents is no longer dominating. It's not an arbitrary power. It's not a power the management can exercise regardless of the wishes of the citizen, of the residents. And I want to say what democratic justice requires and the Republican way of thinking is that there should be some system of control over those who make the laws, right? That ensures that they have to make the laws in a way that doesn't breach the constraints laid on them by citizens. And of course, part of that is that the citizens elect who's in office, but that's only part of it. Another part of it is that citizens can protest through the courts or in the media or on the streets against what government is doing. That's an aspect of democracy too. But it's also essential to democracy is that you've got a law that makes the government controllable. Not only must the citizens control government by electoral and contestatory means, but it must be that those in government are controllable. And what does that require? Well, I would say it requires checks and balances, that the courts are independent, for example, of those in executive office. It requires rule of law constraints, that the government is required to issue laws only that are promulgated publicly, that apply impartially to people, and so on through the rule of law constraints. And it also requires that those in government, for example, government will not be controllable by the citizens otherwise. It also requires that those in government should have to justify, in terms intelligible to ordinary people, the various decisions they make. That applies to those in executive office, justifying their decisions, those in parliament, putting forward their arguments for what they're proposing or laws they're introducing, and to the courts that put forward judgments, opinions in support of the judgments that they make. And it's by having a system of control that makes government controllable by the rule of law, by checks and balances, by the requirement of justification, and that gives citizens a power of electing and contesting what government is doing. That's what vertical justice requires. That's what democratic justice requires. That's what public non-domination requires. Anyhow, that's really, I just wanted to get that in. The third area of justice we don't have time to talk about, and it's much, much more tricky in a way, is that of global justice, justice between peoples, justice between states. Anyhow, I'm not going to say any more than that, but perhaps we've run towards the end of our topics. Anyhow, it's up to you, Jose, and you, William.
Thank you so much, Professor Filippelli. I like so much your answers. I have a question. My English is not.
Jose, Jose, we are running out of time.
Okay, okay, okay. I have a one question more or not?
Quick question. Yes, of course.
Sure,
Yeah.
bem curto. What is different in libertarian independence, Quentin Skinner, and your liberty non-domination? When I interview Quentin Skinner, your conception more philosophical and her more historical conception of liberty, and I like so much your answer.
Well, I think that we're actually very, very close in our views. Quentin has just published a book which I recommend very strongly to you all. It's called Freedom as Independence. And he chooses the word, use the word independence rather than non-domination, but would agree, I think they mean the same thing. Um, and what he does in that book is look at, well, the Roman uh, antecedents of this way of thinking. He wants to argue that this way of thinking about freedom was not just the province of Republican thinkers, that it was shared more widely. And I've always thought I certainly think it's the case now in the light of his work. Um, but of course, it was the way of thinking about freedom that was used by Republican rebels, if you like, in 17th century England, 18th century France, and 18th century America. And equally, I would say, in 19th century South America, where you had so many Republican revolutions, though. And that's a topic maybe we can talk about another time. I do feel that South American republicanism was maybe over influenced by Rousseau and the French tradition, and too little influenced by the British or Roman tradition, but that's another topic. Anyhow, I think we're very much of a common mind about political philosophy. He, of course, has been much more focused on this history of the ideas, and he's really the world expert on that. Whereas I've been more focused on making use of the ideas and updating them in order to think about the contemporary state and contemporary politics, contemporary what justice requires in the contemporary world.
Perfect. I like so much this conversation. I very happy talking to you because I like so much Republic tradition. But in Brazil, Republic tradition, it's not Brazil. It's liberalism or socialism, and I like it so much. You're a gentleman. Thank you so much, Professor Felipe. I
Oh,
like
it's
it.
a real pleasure, and it's a particular pleasure to speak to you in Brazil because, very unfortunately, I had to turn down an invitation some years ago by various judges, actually. It was a legal group in Brazil, which I've always regretted. And I was actually supposed to have been there last November, but that invitation ceased because the institute supporting it, I think, either changed its mind or lost its resources. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it's a great pleasure to speak to you both and to um, for you to give me a hearing, so to speak, in the Brazilian context. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. Stop.